very warm welcome to Sotheby's. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Helena Newman, Chairman here in Europe and Global Head of Impressionist Modern Art. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you here to this Sotheby's talk held in collaboration with IntelligenceSquared on the subject of portraiture. And today we're going to be exploring the power of the portrait from the ancient Egyptians right through to present day AI. And we will look at why does the human likeness continue to captivate us and what insights do portraiture really offer about our society and its evolving nature. And ultimately, how do portraits contribute to our understanding of ourselves? And I'm absolutely delighted that to join us in this conversation, we have two very, very eminent speakers. Simon Schama, Professor of Art History and History at Columbia University, author of countless books and writer and presenter of over 60 television documentaries and on art and history. Thank you, Simon, for being with us today. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you here. And Eleanor Nairne, curator at Barbican Art Gallery here in London, and where she has been absolutely masterminding exhibitions on Lee Krasner, Basquiat, Imran Qureshi, and most recently Alice Neel. So it's wonderful to have this conversation, particularly in the week that the National Portrait Gallery reopens here in London. So portraiture is very much on our mind here at Sotheby's as we host the exhibition of loans from Chatsworth House with the great Rembrandt, and of course as we mount our sails with a theme linked to face-to-face and celebrating portraiture. So Simon, I'd love to start with you, and I think we go right back to the earliest portraits we know.
Right, thank you so much, Hannah. This is, it's not quite ancient Egypt actually, it's rather un-ancient Egypt. It's Fayum portraits, which I'm sure lots of you know, which were accompanied mummified bodies in the Ptolemaic period. So from the late 1st century BC, not many of those. But they go into as late as the 3rd century AD, and this is probably about halfway between. But what I want to say, actually, by way of a preface to this lovely occasion, is that portraiture begins with a fear of death and the worry about impermanence and immortality. I mean, you could say a lot of painting is actually a huge amount of figurative art, or possibly all of figurative art, is driven by the terror of the fugitive, whether it's the landscape or still life, vanished or still life or whatever. But portraiture in the Western traditions begins with these images, and it raises, in the age of Snapchat, where a face will disappear after 10 seconds, or Instagram or Tinder swiping, the compulsion now not to actually nail something down as permanent or even, long lasting. But the second issue that's about classical portraiture, which is, as we unfortunately say in academic journals, problematized, is the notion that portraiture is designed to capture the essential us, that there is something that we judge the artist to the degree to which he's not captured verisimilitude or physiognomy, but something that is the essential you and you. And, in the age of AI and in the age of avatars and everything else, there may be no essential us to capture anymore. So the issue is whether or not portraiture and those who persist heroically in producing portraits simply are impervious to this or don't care or hostile, and whether portraiture as it continues is a kind of fight back against those two. These were, I would have to say, what's really wonderful about them. They're, as you see, startlingly naturalistic. And they were meant to give a sense. They were actually apparently laid on the mummy. Where the mummy's head would be these boards, basically. I mean, they'd be seen as boards. So they were meant to be seen not in some sort of sempiternal way, but as if they'd just come into the room again. And a lot of them are children. Surprising number of children who die very early on. So I think that, which is very, very touching, so that you'd want to have the memory of the child as you happen to see them in some way or another. So pretty much everything about, the psychology of portraiture, I think, is anticipated.
Oh. And you talked about fear of death, and of course self-portraiture is a huge vehicle in a way, and that is, I think, on next.
I love this portrait. He's a bad boy. And think about Salvatore Rosa that I hadn't realized, for a long time, because he was such a favorite of 18th century English collectors, British collectors, wasn't he? But they're all kind of bandits and mountain scenery. They loved that. But he was also very, extraordinarily striking sense of self-possession. Of course, artists, actually, Dürer is the case, were out there rather frontally promoting themselves as artists claiming to be seen as pictor doctus, learned painters, not just artisanal members of a goldsmiths guild of St. Luke. So we have Dürer, of course, classically, and Leonardo and Titian. But they all also depended on patrons. And what's amazing about Salvatore Rosa, documented, I first learned about him from my great friend and colleague, Francis Haskell, who in his wonderful book on Baroque Roman painting, first drew my attention to Baldinucci and Bellori and Rosa's biographers in the middle of the 17th century, that Rosa wanted to have no truck with patrons at all. So if you ever hear art historians telling you that the self-consciousness of the painterly ego begins with the Romantics, that is profoundly a mistake. It actually begins about this period. Switz is a Flemish painter, son of a merchant, lived in Brussels, goes to Rome, and I'll just show you the next. Here he is with, vanished art. So there is a Switz, yes, indeed. And you're going to say, he was famous for emulating Velázquez and painters or other painters he met at Rome. And your instinct saying, well, obviously he'd seen Vermeer. And in fact, actually, there's a connection, because towards the end of Vermeer's life, Balthazar de Moncenis, famous French aristocratic collector and traveller, goes to visit Vermeer. And he has a friend with him, whose name I've forgotten, who's a painter, who was actually Switz's neighbour in Rome when they lived in the Via Margutta. Where else? But everybody, it's much more likely Vermeer copied him, because actually by the time Vermeer gets going in any serious way, Switz is on his way, has an extraordinary mystical Catholic conversion, and on his way to China. He causes so much trouble to the Jesuits whom he's with that they basically evict him, and he goes through this complicated land route and ends up in Goa, where he dies in very mysterious circumstances. So, his life is an extraordinarily wild romance, but it's astonishing painting. The Lenain brothers maybe did heads like this, and there are many of these, and there are old women too. It has a sense of staggering immediacy. That obviously we know happens in Vermeer. So I suppose actually, he saw, you could say it's a tronie. It could have been a maidservant, we don't know. So it could be a kind of genre study in a way, in the Dutch style, or it could have been very specifically, someone whose presence he wanted to register. And, you don't want me to go on about paint handling, but it is very, very remarkable. And the effect of this person being in our presence depends on what the Dutch call houding, which is the relationship and modulation between shadow and highlight, which are very unorthodox, actually, in Switz. And that's what I'll say about him. I want you all to rush home and grab your computer and look him up, and you'll be astonished, really astonished, not just for portraiture either. Here's the wonderful Chatsworth Rembrandt. I have nothing to say about this except blimey. It's a gorgeous thing. It's a gorgeous thing. I think this is not a tronie, even though it's old man. I think it's very likely to have been a commission, don't you? I think, really. And he's wearing this kind of, what looks like an archaic piece of costume, but of course Rembrandt wears it himself in the 1658 portraits in the Frick, and the De Geer, beautiful De Geer portrait, half of the marriage portrait in the National Gallery here, also has this very wonderful old-fashioned kind of tabard, whatever I don't know what you call it. The next picture is also a reflection. Indeed, Lucian Freud called it a reflection. And it is, I think, my favourite Lucian Freud of all. And I have a lot of not favourite Lucian Freuds, but this is an extraordinary picture, 93 I think it is, isn't it? Yeah. Here's the paradigm of him with his bare feet in the shoes. All this is naturalistic. But here is my idea of beauty, me, in the mirror. It's literally a reflection. And the centre of the painting, you can see where the centre of the painting, the seat of genius is, in a supremely Freudian place. We better go on from that. Okay. So I want to show a couple of pictures which seem to be the other way round, which was not just the issue of the artist looking and laying a proprietary claim to the model, but when women start to do self-portraits, they can actually reclaim agency and control over what the gaze does and also what their bodies were. This is Paula Merson-Becker in 1906. She is the first person, as far as I know, to correct me, anybody, to do a nude self-portrait. And she was incredibly, she died tragically young at 31. She was very gifted. She married an artist, not so good, Otto Modersohn. She was Paula Becker in 1901, and she moved to, I always forget what it's called, it's a small town, it was an artist colony near Bremen, begins with W, Wolfersheim, I can't quite remember. And she starts actually, but she becomes very unhappy with Otto, and she goes to Paris. She makes 4 trips to Paris, and in Paris she starts painting herself, as in this case, nude. And you can see she's painting herself pregnant. She wasn't, in fact, pregnant at the time she painted herself in this way. It's very touching. The marriage, for whatever reason, was unconsummated, we know from her letters, for 5 years, and during which time this was painted. And shortly afterwards, she goes back to Otto, and she does conceive, and there's a child, a daughter born, and then she dies 3 weeks later of an embolism. It's absolutely catastrophically tragic, really. It's a terrible story. And I think actually this is sort of, it's very, very moving because it is almost childlike and uncertain and self-curious, really. There are 2 other great nude paintings, but it's a great chapter in sort of instinctive wish to produce a kind of art which takes over, really, from male obsessions. And the last picture in my list, I hope I haven't taken too long, is this masterpiece by Laura Knight in the National Portrait Gallery. How am I doing? I'll just won't go on. Okay, great. And this is fantastic. Laura Knight, also another case of someone married to a much less successful and gifted artist, Harold Knight. And Laura, her mother dies young, she's from Nottingham, and she really has to work very hard to sort of keep the family together. Eventually she finds a way with Harold to actually be part of the famous artist colony in St Ives in Cornwall, is it not? Cornwall or Devon, Cornwall. And she starts to actually play with, again, nude figures on the beach. There are a lot of, they're not very good, actually, I think. They're very joyous and playful and exuberant. There's one very daring nude on the beach, which we only know from a photograph because she destroys it. Then at some point in 1912-13, she paints this amazing picture, which is, the model is a friend of hers called Eleanor Nairne. And formally, you can see it's rather extraordinary. It always haunts me that De Stijl in Holland are doing those experiments which will eventually resolve themselves in Mondrian's art. And she is actually, this is, apart from the figures, it's actually an extraordinarily hypnotic study in the rhyming of horizontal and vertical lines. And the fierceness of the red is a very important tonal part of the power of it. But she, again, we have it. What it is a retort to Déjeuner sur l'herbe. It's a retort to Courbet's studio. All those paintings where all the men get to keep their clothes on and the women are available for nude inspection and decoration and whatever kind of satisfaction. Just the opposite here. We have so it's a brilliant. It's such a kind of thought through piece of stupendous painterly mischief, I think. And I absolutely love it. It's my favourite
Great choice.
picture.
Great
Thank
choice.
you.
Yes. Thank you, Simon.
She never did anything that clever again, alas, actually.
Oh, thank you. Well, that was just an amazing romp through hundreds of years of portraiture. And I think I would love to move on now to some works we will have hanging in our galleries when we open tomorrow, notably, of course, the Klimt portrait, which many of you saw we announced last week, and we're so delighted to have as the star of the seasons, particularly with this theme. And I think it's interesting with Klimt because he's obviously incredibly well known for his commissioned portraits, and we haven't actually talked a lot about that yet, the difference between the self-portraits, the commissioned portraits, and the portraits with paid models or procured models. But I think with Klimt there's a special dynamic going on because Vienna at the beginning of the 20th century didn't really have an established gallery scene. I mean, it's not like in Paris or Berlin where there was a proper modern art gallery scene. So as an artist, Klimt really needed these commissions. I mean, they were his way to promote and sell his work, and actually he became an incredibly well-paid, probably one of the most well-paid portrait artists of his time in the early 20th century. And of course he's famous for the golden Bloch-Bauer and the great portraits of members of the Lederer family and the Wittgenstein family and Felsevani and all these great large typically vertical format, obviously portrait format commissions. But alongside that he painted obviously his landscapes, the allegorical, and then these non-commissioned portraits of models. And here you see him really in his full kind of freedom of expression. He's not constrained by any demands from the patron. He is adopting the square format, which I think sort of breaks down the hierarchy of sitter and background, and that has an amazing effect here with the drapery of this chinoiserie and Asian style cloth that is put behind the model. And then of course, because she is a model that he's taken for the purpose of his work, he has almost painted her nude. I mean, there's even a theory when you look at the drawings that prepare for this work that she started nude and then he clothed her and put the kimono on and put the fan in front of her breast. But however it's composed, it is I think a wonderful example of that beginning of the 20th century influence of secessionism merged with, of course, the obsession with Japaneserie and Chinese culture at the time, which was so prevalent in Vienna. And also, I think what's very interesting about this is it sets the scene of what is to come in the 20th century, because that strong portraiture in Vienna, which then leads to artists like Schiele and Kokoschka, who in turn are drawing on that tradition of the other Freud and psychoanalysis, kind of sets the scene for 20th century portraiture and that study of the inner world of the artist and the inner world of their subjects, which becomes so expressive and so important all the way through. Now, very different, when you see this, you will be surprised, it's a very small format Fini. We were looking at it just now when we were coming down for this talk. Incredibly powerful self-portrait by the artist associated with the Surrealist movement, Eleanor Nairne. But I think looking out with this incredible boldness, and she's chosen panel to paint it on, which I think is very much a kind of looking back at the old masters and do you think that sort of sense of the northern European tradition of the dramatic light, very powerful, very much, this is me and I will paint in my way and show myself. What did you think, Eleanor?
The angle of her gaze as well. That angle of the look completely goes back to the history of mirrors coming in the kind of 15th century in Europe. And suddenly you're looking askance because you're looking at the mirror here and then capturing it here, which you can tell because one eye is normally in focus and one eye is normally slightly soft.
And I think here she's making that link in art history. She's saying, I'm this artist and I'm as good as the men and I have that come from that tradition. And she's very bold and outward going. In fact, most of her work is not self-portraiture. It's quite a rare self-portrait. Mostly she's doing quite allegorical subjects and very surreal compositions, but this is a rare small.
Should say that as you're seeing it in the slide version, but really when you go and see it, the actual compression is incredible. It was a sort of brilliant thing to actually miniaturize it. It ramps up the intensity of that case, I think, actually, and very narrow,
format.
in the tiny format.
But also I think sometimes it's tempting for us to look at a work like this and to say this is a woman wanting to establish herself in the canon. Often it's just an artist wanting to establish themselves as an artist. You know, it has never been easy to be an artist in almost all sets of circumstances, especially once patronage gave way and you were making portraits without any sense of who you might sell them to. And so I think often when you have that intensity of look, it's a person saying, will I make it? You know, and will the work make it? And will I make it? And what is the relationship between the two?
Yes, no, I totally agree, but I think it's inevitable that we look at it through our eyes now. But then when you read about what was going, you know, the whole sort of surrealist movement and that interaction with Breton, Max Ernst and everything, it was a very male-dominated world, even though there were all the women interweaving with their complex relationships around it. So, but I agree, Eleanor. It's we can only bring our perspective as ever. But the next one is the Freud that is hanging here, which actually I really think you have to look at up close to appreciate its full complexity. And, you know, I chose this because not only is it coming up, and so you have the opportunity to see it firsthand, but when we talk about portraiture, you know, there's what you see in the painting, the actual figure, but there is the artist. I think what's powerful about this is the artist is present without painting himself. So if you think of, you know, Freud, his two giant subjects are the self-portraits and the nudes. But here, although he's not in there, he seems to be present in every bit of the composition, the sort of open door to the wardrobe with his coat hanging there, the reflection in the window that just seems to nod at the easel, and actually the figure of the nude is small in a composition when it's set, which itself is very compact for Freud. So it's a very interesting use, I think, of space and the model and the artist's presence in a beautiful nighttime interior.
It's brilliantly creepy.
Is that all you're going to say about it, Simon?
No, I could say more. I think there's a lot of Walter Sickert in. I think there's a lot of Walter Sickert in this. I'd say, of Sickert, of kind of memories of Sickert. Yeah.
And Eleanor?
Yeah, I mean it's alienating, I think.
Yeah.
You know,
it is so not a portrait.
To
it is so not a portrait because it is.
It's in the interior with the figure of the model. But yeah, there's a classification situation.
It's a document, really. It's a document.
But a lot of Freud there is subliminally in the every aspect of how he's composed it. So, and then we have the Saville, which is a real coup, and you go from the small Viennese self-portrait to this absolutely monumental, incredibly expressive oil on paper. I mean, an absolute giant of a painting, and not necessarily a known sitter, but even as an unknown sitter, I think Jenny brings a lot of herself in it as well. So it has that sort of sense of aspects of self-portraiture and, you know, bringing in images from photographs and collected images. But what is not captured in this slide is the surface of this work, which is spectacular. I mean, it's almost as if she's started with the texture and then literally molded the face and the features from the paint. It's so thick, the oil. It's almost like the flesh is being created through the paint. And that, you know, with Jenny, when you hear her speaking, she's much more articulate talking about her work than I am. But she talks a lot about her experiences of actually going to see you know, plastic surgery and see, you know, the dissections and flesh being worked, and that is really what you sense in front of that. It's incredibly powerful and expressive and as I say, monumental.
Well, also, given the last 100 years of painting have been largely bifurcated between figuration and abstraction, often falsely, it allows her to do both, to exist in both. You know, you look at it up close and it has these great painterly swathes to it, but also kind of resolves into this extraordinary image. And given that we live in a landscape in which women are regularly pasted onto billboards the size of buildings. It has a relationship to the idea of what a face can be and can sell in today's culture as well.
I think two things. I think she's an extraordinary handler of materials, really. I mean, she takes the kind of texture of what you can do and what resists in paint very, very seriously. She's extremely old-fashioned in the best possible way, in that way. And then again, I think you couldn't possibly see a painting like this and not realize that she's interested in damage. I mean, there are much more. If this looks worrying to you, check out some of the other pieces that Jenny did. She's interested in the instability of faces when they both, as Anna says, sort of surgical differences, all kinds of mutilations, changes, and morphing processes fascinate her. And wonderfully, I think, her genius is really to make a marriage of beauty and violence that actually works. And I do think, again, I do take your point that, one mustn't over-radicalize, stretch to radicalizing. But in her case, and we haven't talked about the early extraordinary paintings like Prop, which are self-portrait, even though when I first met Jenny, I expected her to be a very large woman, that she's beautiful and very slight. So she too lied massively in the direction of turning herself into a kind of gargantuan figure, a monumental figure. So she has done something within the paradigms, actually, of in a way, I won't say traditional painting, but using the traditional materiality and tools of representational art that is nonetheless thematically. Is thematically genuinely revolutionary, I think, and it's very. I find that incredibly heartening, because when you what you don't want to do, I think we'll probably hesitate. I don't want to speak for you two, but what you don't want to do is to divide wonderfully spirited and accomplished and dynamically fresh art into the old stuff and the new stuff. And Jenny is a kind of supreme example, there are others I could mention, of resisting that foolish polarization. Yeah.
It's spectacular, truly spectacular. But Eleanor, let's turn to you and what you have chosen to focus on. And
I have a small number, a small choice selection of things that I thought would be interesting to kind of throw into the mix. One is this extraordinary Degas. I'm sure some of you here will have had a chance to see the Degas Manet show at the d'Orsay in Paris. And it is probably one of the most exciting shows I think I've had the privilege of seeing in recent years. For those of you who don't know it, this is a painting that Degas made of Manet and his wife, which so enraged Manet that he cut his wife out of the picture. And so they include it in the exhibition as this kind of extraordinary testament. Use the word document. It is a kind of fascinating historical document to this controversial, difficult, testy friendship that existed between these two artists. Even to use the word friendship is maybe a little bit of a reach. But I wanted to include it because I think it's very easy for us to look at portraiture now and see it as a rather traditional, sometimes quite polite genre of painting, and to forget the kind of fierce provocation that it might lay down. And of course, in this instance, it's probably could be provoked by there being a sense of who were the women who were in paintings during this period. They were often people who were sex workers as well, or they might have been immediate family members, but there was a kind of thrill of intimacy. Perhaps he felt, what right has he to paint my wife? The person who paints my wife is me, There's so much in that dynamic that we don't know and can't understand, couldn't possibly know, but I kind of love it as a testament to what portraiture can set off within us. And then something much more recent, some of you will have seen the Alice Neal show that I did at the Barbican. This was the work that we actually opened with. I think as a curator, you always have to know where are you going to begin the story. And the answer should almost certainly not be with the student work. so there's a question about, you need to open in media res and what's the kind of captivating beginning. And for me, I knew I wanted to start with this because it's a pretty unprecedented image. I think octogenarian female nudes, I could probably otherwise only cite that great Maria Lasnig painting with the gun to her head and the gun out of the painting, which is also an astonishing piece, and this is made about 20 years prior to that. It took 5 years. She wasn't working consistently on it for 5 years. She was encouraged to begin it when she was 75 years old in 1975, and she found it fantastically difficult. She dedicated a whole career to making what she called pictures of people. She detested the word portrait in the same way that she thought it was fussy, but she finally kind of settles on this work, and there's so many things you could say about it, but one of them is that it is wonderfully unapologetic in her depiction of her aging body, and also that she leaves her glasses on. So we have a number of great paintings, self-portraits of artists wearing glasses. And it was, I think, a way, has been, continues to be a way for artists to encircle their sight, both literally the main central tool of their trade, but also their insight, their capacity, their perspicacity, their ability to see things as they really are. And, Simon started by talking about, what does portraiture mean in an age of technology? Certainly verisimilitude doesn't really have a place, hasn't had a place, arguably for 150 years or more. One of the things I found myself saying when I was able to live amongst Alice Neal's work for this short sort of 3-month period was that you won't like every painting, but the ones that capture you are because she understood the right degree of wrong. She was kind of wonky in the best of ways, and sometimes they kind of killed her off stage, and sometimes they just kind of hold their own. And when you have the pleasure of meeting either the people who sat for them or some of the relatives of the people who sat for them, you really see how she managed to capture very vividly something that's not easy to set down in paint. So that was why we kind of had to open the show with this one. The second of hers that I wanted to include is this painting of John Perrault, which the team thought was particularly funny because he was a curator. So he was doing a show about the male nude. He was a critic and a curator at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And he wanted to borrow a very radical painting that she made, that some of you will have seen, of Joe Gould, who has kind of multiple sets of genitalia, that she made in the 1930s, which was, truly a brazen image. And she said, oh, well, surely other artists are allowed to include new work. And he said, well, yes, some people are making new painting. And she said, right, there it is, I shall paint you then. Because how could you possibly go about curating a show of the male nude without being a male nude yourself? Yes. And of course, going back to the Degas Manet show, this is her male Olympia. This is a fantastic opportunity. And Chantal Joffe, the artist, had a great line in which she said, he looks like nothing so much as a big ginger Tom. And I think it's really a good line. She was very good at capturing the kind of animalistic qualities within each of us. And then some of you will have also seen this show, which I wanted to use really as an opportunity to kind of open up the question of portraiture, which if the Freud sets you off, this is really going to set you off, to kind of how do we determine what constitutes a portrait? So this is a painting made by Sahela Sokanvari, who did a new commission for us in the Curve last autumn. She made a suite of new paintings, all of feminist icons from pre-revolutionary Iran. So this is Farooq Farrokhzad, who was, for those of you who don't know, one of the great modernist poets in pre-revolutionary Iran. She wrote an incredible collection of poems called Sin, for which she was subjected to electroshock treatments. They were in part about her having an adulterous affair. She had her child taken away from her. You know, she has a truly, truly terrible experience. And so Hela wanted to make these images. They're all black and white, but with tiny coloured details, because she's drawing from promotional materials. You know, of course, these women couldn't come and sit for her. Most of them are no longer alive. Those who are alive are living largely in exile in Europe and America. But she wanted to make both portraits of these individual women. So we have a picture of an install shot as well, for those of you who didn't see the exhibition. So each one of these rosettes has, so the whole curve was painted in these Islamic geometric patterns, and each one of the rosettes has one of the portraits in the middle. So it was a pantheon, basically, dedicated to these women. And so she both wanted to create a testament to their individual stories, because many of those have been censored. This was also at the Barbican Art Gallery. I don't know if you're familiar with the Barbican, but they have been doing some rather remarkable exhibition making of late.
So if you zoom right in, each of those...
So each one of those rosettes has its own miniature painting in it, and they're made in egg tempera. I mean, speak about reclaiming ancient techniques. So she's making them in a way whereby in 1,000 years that painting will still exist. So if you're concerned about the censorship of these women's histories, here is a way to say, I will tell this story and I will ensure that it survives. But it's also a way of her telling her own story. It is in many respects the whole kind of installation a self-portrait, because here is somebody who came to the UK when she was 14, fleeing from the revolution, who hasn't been able to go back for at least 20 years, who's trying to understand how did we get to be here? How did I literally get to be here? And so I think it's interesting when you see these projects which kind of open up an expanded notion of what might constitute a portrait or a self-portrait.
Oh, incredible. That's fantastic. And then I think you've chosen...
Oh, well, if you really want to explode the notion of the portrait. So I was going to show a short clip of film, but then, you know, it never quite works out like that in presentations. But Julianknxx is an artist who I'm working with this autumn, and he has many descriptions for himself as an artist, but one of them that I like is a poetic archivist. And he's the kind of root of his practice is in poetry, but he also makes film and sculpture and other work. And he has been busy for the last 3 years working with choirs across Europe and asking each choir to sing the same central song that he's composed with his musical director, but then also interviewing them and trying to use their kind of each of these choirs as a way to get an insight into experiences within the Black diaspora across Europe and kind of spaces of resonance between their experiences and spaces of dissonance between their experiences. And so to try and create a portrait of something that is by definition impossible to portray or impossible to create a singular portrait of. So I'm also very interested in these contemporary practitioners who are trying to find ways, different ways of depicting quite complex ideas outside of what can be contained within a picture frame.
I mean, that's a wonderful way to come to the end of the slides and try to wrap up a very, far-reaching conversation, because I think that it also brings the whole question of what will happen now, really, and how it will be with portraiture in the future, given the combination of imagery that we now, all living with.
I mean, one of the things that was very interesting for me to see with the Alice Neel exhibition is that, a bit like people are endlessly tempted to say painting is dead, the same thing might be said for portraiture, and yet there is this real resistance to that. I think because people live in a very busy, demanding, highly technologized age in which something about not just painting, but in the instance of Alice Neel, she was painting almost exclusively from life, from models, from people who would come and sit for her. I sometimes joke that the John Perrault painting, she asked him to sit 17 times. I'm not sure it took 17 sittings. But, these are paintings made from life, and in the wake specifically of what lots of us experienced during the pandemic, of being very atomized and experiencing one another through screens. I think people have only come to crave painted portraits even more.
Yeah, I think there are, no, that's true. I think the whole sense of the instability of the self, I mean, there's a huge paradox which may or may not be good, actually. I mean, I see this in my students. On the one hand, this identity has become very unstable, particularly in an age of migration, really cultural migration, which can produce extraordinarily beautiful hybrid kind of sense of identities that are brought together and disappear. I tell you, I'm thinking of while I'm saying this. We lost, apart from the horrific human tragedy of Grenfell Tower, we lost a really great artist in Khadija Sen, who was a photographic artist who did self-portraits in ritualized African traditions from the world her family and her mother in particular had come from, but also deeply informed by sense of how you might or might not be able to sustain that in London, in the new place. That sort of sense of migratory instability, you know, it has the potential for enormous, creative power, actually, creative inventiveness. My basic sense of actually portraiture being constantly re-examining why it happens, why it should be tackled. Jenny Saville's a wonderful example of that. Alice Neil's an incredibly brilliant masterpiece that I think actually of her aged 80 or whatever it is a good thing, but it will evolve in lots of different ways, I think, that we don't yet quite anticipate.
Well, thank you. Look, I'd like, first of all, to thank our speakers, Simon and Eleanor, for sharing your kind of wonderfully idiosyncratic and choices for this talk. We couldn't possibly even begin to show everything, and even as we put the slides up, we regretted we hadn't inserted further ones, but it's really just to provoke the conversation and, you know, to provoke thought, as it is the theme of this week here in London, and it's, I think, an enduring one that will be forever part of our human identity, and wherever there will be art, there will be portraits. So thank you for being with us, and this is really now the opportunity for you to say your bit and ask your questions, because we have a bit of time still, don't we, Hannah? But if anyone would like to, there we go, but I think we'll bring you a mic, and
hello.
Yes.
This is a question, I'm sure you've heard it many times before, but the balance between what does a portrait say more about the artist or more about the sitter? And
yes.
okay, we all recognise the Rembrandt or some of the Freuds. Do we know who the benefits one was, or we just say, are we buying a Freud? And again, where does that balance lie, and does it really matter? You know, it's a thought.
I think it's a fantastically good question. I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting that the National Portrait Gallery, for instance, it's about the distinction of the sitter. So although they have some work by some brilliant artists in there, first and foremost, it's about the sitter, and then the decision is made about who the right artist might be to be able to capture that sitter.
So I know somebody who Freud did a portrait, and he said it was like having a third person in the room, where somewhere between the sitter and the artist was the portrait.
Well, I think it's actually a triangulation, I'd have to say.
Yeah.
I think there is a third person involved in this, even if it's a private commission, namely you, us. Yeah. And so I've always thought of it as a kind of triangular relationship, really, when it works.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
And then I think we can wrap up. And thank you again, Simon Schama. Thank you very much. Eleanor Nairne, thank you for being with us. Really, really thank you.